Everyone. And the meeting is being recorded, Alex. Hope that's okay.
That's fine.
Great. So we're really delighted to have Alex Ezeh with us today. So Dr. Ezeh is a professor in global health at Drexel University, and he has worked for many, many years very extensively on various demographic and population health issues across countries in Africa. And we're excited to hear about some of that work today. And for many years, he was also the executive director of the African Population and Health Research Center. And he was really instrumental in sort of driving the growth and phenomenal success of this organization over the last few decades. So I've never met Dr. Ezeh personally, but I've heard him speak many times at PAA. So I'm really excited that he's joining us today. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aisha, and thank you, Josh. Thank you all for having me. It's always a pleasure to engage with UC Berkeley. I've had the opportunity to come there a couple of times and have many years of collaboration with a number of colleagues there, from Malcolm Potts to Ndola to even Ed Miguel and a number of other projects. So it's quite a pleasure to be back and to be able to talk to you about some of the work I'm doing here. I'm actually excited to speak on this issue because I feel I'm in a crowd or company that I'm not usually around quite often. And I trained as a demographer, but I've done a whole lot of my work in public health and global health. So I speak more of health issues than population issues. But it's always a pleasure each time I have an opportunity to talk about population issues because it's something I care about, and it's something that I really feel is critical to every other thing we try to do. So thank you for the invitation. My talk today reflects on an existing work that I have been actually struggling to find some time to complete amidst competing priorities. So forgive me if it doesn't really come out or come through with some crisp clarity because it's work in progress. There is no doubt that population growth in Africa will continue to attract attention of demographers and development planners for a long time to come. So that's really a good point to begin to think about what are the drivers and implications of future population trajectories in Africa. So we can start with a basic question of why demographic trends matter. Why do we care about demographic trends? I think for many people, you may have many different reasons why we care about population issues and trends. But the most obvious reason, I think, for many people will often, and often it could be the most common reason why such information is important, is that we need it for planning. But that actually begs the question, why do we need demographic data for planning? I think at the core of our collective interest in population trajectories is the desire to improve human well-being. Whether you look from Malthus to LH to the current day, safeguarding human well-being is at the core of the interest in population dynamics. However, despite increased sophistication in our measurement tools and our projections, we still have large confidence intervals in these projections and estimates, especially when we look further along into the future in terms of extending these projections to, for example, 2100. So we have a challenge that these estimates still raise quite a lot of uncertainties around them and what they mean. So the UN Population Division has been generating population projections for countries and territories, and as well as the world, different world regions and for the world as a whole since 1963. So to date, I think there's been about 23 of such projections, they call them revisions, like the last one was in 2019, and we're expecting the next one to be anytime soon in 2021 revision to be released soon. But that's only one of maybe 3 different models that we've seen that's come up in the recent past in terms of projecting future population growth globally. In 2007, the World Population Program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, Austria, started producing projections as well of global populations. And last year, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, IHME, at the University of Washington, released their maiden projection of global and regional and national population estimates and projections also to 2100. And they did take into account some other scenarios, which is always a key point in these projections. All these projections tell the same story, that global population will be somewhere around 8.9 billion if you look at the IHME estimate, or 10.9 billion if you look at the UN Population Division median variant estimates by 2100. They also show 2 distinct demographic trajectories. One basically for the rest of the world, and the other for Sub-Saharan Africa. The first, for the rest of the world, is characterized by significant population declines that sometimes exceed 50% or even 60% of the current population of some of the countries in this that are characterized by this phase of population change. And on the other, where you have population growth, you actually see a tripling or quadrupling, and in some instances, a 7-fold increase in the population of some of these countries from their current level today. I believe these divergent patterns are evident today and will continue to grow into the future. And they are both significant, and they both have significant implications for well-being. So if we accept the hypothesis that our interest in population trajectories is really around how population issues affect human well-being, then these 2 divergent trajectories that we are witnessing and seeing have implications for human well-being. So let me have just a quick word on population decline. I think these divergent patterns, they create an exciting opportunity for demographic inquiry. In particular, most of the concerns around population has been framed around the negative consequences of rapid population growth. I think it is time to shift the gaze and begin to understand the implications of declining population size on well-being. Look at Japan as an example. Its current population is about 126 million people. By 2050, by 2100, it is expected to drop to about 75 million. That's a change of almost that's about 60% of its current size. Then that's a 40% decline in this population. South Korea will be under 30 million from its current size of about 59 million. Albania is a small country, but it currently has a population of about 3 million people. By 2100, it will have a population of about 1 million people. That's almost a third of its current, about a third of its current size now. So a lot of the interest that we have, we've expressed, and the studies that try to look at low fertility levels and extremely low fertility levels and population decline have really focused a lot on issues around productivity and healthcare and pension systems and all of those, which are important because they have direct implications for well-being. But I think that the demographic research and demographic inquiry also should extend beyond these issues to look at what are the implications of this phenomenal change in the populations of many of these countries on other things. Take, for instance, urbanization. What would cities like Tokyo and Osaka and Seoul be like in 2100 with a population of the country that is 40% less or 50% less? How would the built environment look like? What would the educational systems look like in these places if there are 65% less children in Japan in 2100? I think these are questions that we need to begin to confront and begin to think the implications of this trajectory of population change that we are facing. But there is no question that we have not begun to scratch the surface of understanding population decline and its implications on well-being. And I think this is an area that demographic work needs to also pay a lot of attention to. But for today, I'm looking at Sub-Saharan Africa particularly, and I will talk of Africa more broadly because Sub-Saharan Africa accounts for quite a large population, and in many of the estimates that I have is just for Africa as a whole. So part of what makes the moment an exciting period to begin to look at demographic trajectories is the divergent patterns I've tried to express now. The thing about these divergent patterns is the fact that they're actually highly localized within specific geographies. While most of the world will increasingly struggle with the challenges of declining population, Sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly East, Central, and West Africa, will continue to deal with the challenges of rapid population growth. The region's population will almost quadruple from about 1.1 billion today to 3.8 billion by 2100. Of the 54 countries in Africa, only Mauritius and Seychelles will experience a smaller population size in 2100 relative to their size today. Indeed, by 2100, many of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, their population will still continue to grow, so they would not have reached their peak by 2100. In some countries like Niger, the estimate is that the population will almost be 7 times larger by 2100 than it is today. It will grow from about 24 million people in 2020 to about 165 million people. By 2100, Sub-Saharan Africa will account for 36% of the global population from its current size, proportion of 14%. Currently, it's about 14% of the global population.
Alex, can I just interrupt for 1 second? I think there's a question in the chat just asking you to clarify the units of the y-axis.
Okay, that's population in millions. So this is like 4 billion at 4 billion.
It's in millions, I see.
Yeah, that's population in millions. Okay, so this is the reality of the context in which we are discussing the implications and consequences of these types of growth within the region. As noted earlier, the UN Population Division started in 1963. Then the projections were made up to the year 2000. And I think if you think of 1963 to 2000, it looked like a long time ago from 1963. So the projections were to 2000. They did not start to project beyond 2000 until 1978, when they extended these projections to 2050 and then to 2100, but missing most of the years in between. So if you looked at the 1963 projections, the first projection that was extended to 2050 was in 1978. And that gave a projected size of Africa's population in 2050 as 1.86 billion. That's in red. By 2100, the population of Africa was projected in the 1963 project, in the 1978 projection to 2.19 billion. Almost every subsequent projection that the UN has generated since 1978 has provided a much larger size of the Africa's population in 2050 and 2100. The only exception to these increases were in the 1990s revisions, when, and particularly in 1996, which you see in purple, the third bar there. And this was because of the adjustments that they made due to the impact of HIV/AIDS on Africa's population. So they adjusted the projected size because of HIV/AIDS and the implications it was having then. That was at the height of the AIDS crisis on the continent. And that's the only time you see a decline. But every other subsequent revision of the projections came up with a larger population size for Africa. While changes in projection methods and assumptions may explain a small part of these changes, the most significant factor are the availability of new data from surveys and censuses that provide more current estimates of the population of various countries on the continent. It is important to note that these changes are particularly unique to Africa, as the projections for other regions of the world tended to show much smaller population with each subsequent revision. So Sub-Saharan Africa is the one that every time this is released, it actually makes noise because the new estimates are much larger than the previous ones. And you can see that clearly in this chart. This is another way of presenting the same result, and it tells the same story. And here you're still looking at the population of Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa, Africa up to the year 2050 for Africa, for the different revisions from the UN from 1963 to 2017. And as you move from the earlier ones to the later ones, you begin to see this steep continued increase, consistent increase in the population size of Africa. The UNDP's 1998 revision projected Sub-Saharan Africa's population in 2050 to about 1.52 billion. This projection was revised to 1.75 billion in 2008 and to 2.12 billion in 2019. This is for the period up to 2050. Is it possible that Africa has consistently exceeded UNDP's projections? Is it possible that the population growth in Africa is actually faster than the UN projections? So to examine this question, I looked at various UN population divisions projections of Africa's population. Each revision projects forward, but they also provide estimates backwards to show what the population was at various times in the past using all the current available information. So differences with these back estimations are generally very small. What is evident from this analysis is that the estimated population of Africa in any given year is higher than the projected size that the UN had come. So what I did was, if you take 1980 as an example, in red is the earliest projection of the population of Africa in 1980, which was in 1963. And because the 1963 projections only ended up to the year 2000, for 2010 and 2015, the earliest projection of the 2010 population was based in 1978. So that's where what you have in red. In green is the latest projection that is closest to the year, to the index year we are looking at. So when you're looking at 1980, the closest projection to 1980 was in 1978. And then what we did was to include the estimated population of Africa in 1980 from the most immediate revision post 1980, and that would be the 1982 revision. So you are comparing the projection that was made in 1978 of the population of Africa in 1980 and the estimate of the population of Africa in 1980 from the 1982 revision. And what you see is consistently in purple, that number is higher than this. And this might take you that it's a very small thing, but if you look at 2015, and you're looking at the 2017 estimate of the 2015 population of Africa versus the 2012 projection of the population of Africa in 2015, is a difference of 300 million people. So even though these lines might tell you that they are not huge, they are quite significant numbers of people involved.
Do you mind if I ask a question here, just so I understand?
Sure.
So the red bars are not from one forecast, they're from a moving forecast. So the red bar in 2015 is not from the 1963 forecast?
The red bar is from the 1963 forecast.
Also,
and the green bar, sorry?
Also in 2015?
No, for 2015, it is from the 1978, because that's the first time they projected the population beyond 2000, beyond 2000. So you're taking their earliest projected size of the population in 2010 and in 2015, and that was in 1978.
So the earliest is a moving window, the latest is a moving window, and the estimated is, well, I guess also moving because, but okay. So yeah. Is this a little bit different than you were showing before, where the forecast has been moving up?
So what this is trying to show is, one is that you can show that the forecast is moving, but it doesn't really tell you that the reason why it is moving is because the population is growing faster than the projection. And the only way you can actually demonstrate that the population is growing faster than the projection is to look backwards on what would the population have been, what was the population projected to be. Let's say we have 2020 today. We can look at the first time 2020 projection was made, and the most recent projection of the 2020 population, which was in 2019. And we can actually, if we get the 2021 projection, we can get an estimate of what the population was in 2020. So the estimates, which is in purple, is coming from the most recent evidence and data, taking into account censuses that's been done since the last projection and any other surveys that's been done to give you the current size of these countries and regions.
I guess what I don't understand is if for the 2015, the red bar is higher than the other colors, and then you say consistently estimated African population exceeds the closest projection size. It seems like it's the other way around for 2015.
Okay, let me explain that. So in 2010 and 2015, the red bar is higher because the population projections actually for from 1978, remember with the WFS surveys that came up in the 70s, and with the start of the DHS, a lot of the projections from about 1978 to 1988 actually showed very high levels of population growth in Africa, because there were new data that were not existing before that showed very high levels of fertility. So there were revisions that showed much larger increases within those periods. But, and that 1978 to 2010 is not too far off, but if you take the 78 and you project it to 2100, it's still lower than the current projections of the population of Africa to 2100. So even though it was very high in 1978, and relative to the estimates then in 2008 and 2012 for 2010, this, okay. So the point there is that if you look at 1980 and 1990, this data remains consistent. For here, what is going on is that there were new evidence that generated much larger increases in the projected population for that period. So here you can actually compare the green and the purple to get the story of how the estimates compare with the projections.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Sure. So at every time the UN releases its new projections, there's always a fuss about Africa's population size because it keeps getting bigger. But how is it possible that Africa has actually been exceeding this large projected size in its population? Last year, the IHME released its on projections. And I had a piece in the Lancet with colleagues that we looked at why Africa might exceed its projected population size by 2100. So in this particular piece, the key point that we underscored, and my hypothesis then was that the major factor driving Africa to exceed its projected population size is its mean age at first birth. Age at first birth affects intergenerational gap, which compounds population growth. At the same level of fertility, mortality, net migration, contraceptive use, age structure, and size, a population in which all women start childbearing at age 20 will at least be 20% larger in 100 years than another population with exactly the same parameters, but the only difference is that women start childbearing at age 25. In one, you will have 5 generations of people. In another, you will have 4 generations of people. Mean age at first birth, if you think about it, in Japan or South Korea is about 31 years. In Africa, it's about 20, 21. If you look at the 27 countries in the world where mean age at first birth is 20 years or less, 24 of them are in Africa. It is not only that early age at first birth has direct effect of increasing fertility through longer exposure to the risk of pregnancy. It also affects fertility indirectly by limiting women's access to other opportunities associated with lower fertility, like female education, formal employment, contraceptive use, and other factors. Additionally, the fact that life expectancy has been increasing in Africa could be another reason why the growth in population in Africa can be more rapid than it's been projected to be by the UN over the years. There is no question that high fertility is the primary determinant of future population growth in Africa. If you use the UN median trajectory variant, and you look at it in the blue, the deep blue line up there, that's what the population is projected to be by 2100, about 4 billion people. If actually we can model different changes in population and what effects they will have on this projected size, the results of this will show that if you can delay childbearing by 2 years on average, without changing the number of children women have, you could actually reduce the projected population by about 10%. 10% doesn't look like it's much, but that is 400 million people less by 2100. If we can eliminate all the unwanted fertility on the continent, we can actually reduce, just by itself, without thinking about any other change at all, we can actually reduce population growth by as much as 25%, which is about 1.1 billion people. Note that These are arguably the most conservative estimates or projections based on these changes. They do not account for other changes to fertility preferences or feedback mechanisms from an increase in family planning. This demographic modeling does not even take into consideration socioeconomic determinants that may also influence changes in fertility rates, including these feedback loops that I talk about. So the opportunity to bend or change this trajectory is enormous. But the question for me, which is really, why is it critical for Africa to address its population, this population growth? I think the issue of population has remained quite emotive, even in Africa. And these concerns can easily and often rightly be interpreted as veiled racism or anti-African sentiments, especially when controlling immigration of Africans to other countries underpins such concerns on the population growth and size in Africa. For me, however, the fundamental question for Africa to address, the fundamental reason for Africa to address its population growth is the issue of the need to sustain investments in human capital development in Africa. A tripling of the population of Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa over the next 80 years indicates the need to triple existing resources and infrastructure, whether they're in health, in education, housing, or energy, over that same period, just in order to maintain the current levels of basic services that are actually not adequate. So if we combine this growth and the need to maintain these levels of inadequate coverage of these services with the current annual shortfall in infrastructural investments in Africa, which the African Development Bank estimates at 52 to 64%, or about $130 to $170 billion as the financing gap for infrastructure in Africa. If we combine that with this demographic trajectory, then the challenges they pose for Africa is actually very daunting. It is not a question of whether there will be 2 billion Africans by 2100 or 6 billion Africans by 2100. It is a question of what quality of Africans will these be. The ability to provide basic health, education, and nutritional services necessary for developing human capital capacity on the continent will be severely constrained by the projected rates of population growth, which I hope I have convinced you has generally underestimated the true rate of growth of the population in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. So we have lots of time for questions, which is great. I see a lot of comments in the chat. If anyone wants to unmute and ask, that is completely fine. Or I can start with a question that I have. So one of the things that you mentioned, Alex, is this mean age of childbearing. I was wondering if you could comment on how this has changed over time, perhaps. And secondly, is there spatial variation in this across Sub-Saharan Africa? And sort of, can we gain insight on sort of, what are the drivers behind that?
Thanks, Aisha. Of course, whenever we talk about Africa, the biggest challenge is thinking about 54 countries on the continent and trying to make sense of. There are always variations, and many times the variations there are larger than between Africa and the rest of the world. You just look at the growth that we talked about. Niger will increase sevenfold. Mauritius and Seychelles will decline by, I think, 10 to 30% by 2100. So that's the type of variation you have across the continent. Is always very large. And in age at first marriage, age at first birth, it's actually quite also diverse. But I think for many countries, particularly in the Sahel region, it is quite low. and in Southern Africa, it is higher. And so, so there are differences, but for the majority of West and Central Africa, it still remains low. And in some parts of East Africa, it remains quite low. What drives it? One is still early age at marriage. And that's one of the factors. And in many countries, still the legally age at first marriage, the legal age at first marriage is still below 18 years of age. And that's something that needs to change, at least for a start. It's no brainer that needs to be done. But the other is also the issue of access to female education. If you think about different parts of the Sahelian region, where still 70% of girls who finish primary school, but they don't go to secondary school, what do you do? And how long can you stay out without going to school, without marrying? And so they enter into marriage. And so there are a lot of structural challenges as well that affect age at first birth and on the continent. But yeah, there are variations, but overall, as I said, about 24 of the 54 countries in the region, the mean age at first birth is still 20 years or less.
And just as a follow-up, do we see a time trend in that? Are we seeing changes over time, or not so much?
I mean, I think there has been some change over time, but it's actually been minimal. It's not been very, and I mean, mean ages, they will change not very drastically because these are stock variables you look at. But there has been in a number of countries, yeah, I think if you look at DHS that were done in the 80s and early 90s, and you look at the more recent ones, you will see some shifts in that across different countries, but generally still much lower. And when you compare that with the rest of the world, you're looking at 10 to 13 years earlier in some instances, because in many places globally it's about 26.
I see. I think, Dennis, you have a couple of questions. Do you want to just unmute and ask?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think a few people made comments kind of related to this, which is I'm just wondering if you could help us understand what assumptions the UNPD projections are making about fertility in Africa. In other words, are they presuming that there will be some kind of decline over time? And is this based on predicted changes in education? Oh, sorry. I'm wondering if you could help us understand what assumptions the UNPD projections are making about fertility in Africa over time, over the time between now and 2100. So are they projecting a decline? And if so, is that based on projections of economic growth or education changes or what?
Okay, so the three projections that I talked about make different assumptions. If you look at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, they make a lot of assumptions around the trends in education and how that could affect fertility and take that into account. And that's one of the reasons why their estimates lower than the UN population division. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation actually made a number of other assumptions, looking at both economic growth and different other factors that could affect fertility, including cohort fertility measures and all of those. So they brought in and contraceptive use, and but in the UN, the assumption for Africa is that the fertility will go down. Actually, almost to, if I remember, almost to replacement level by 2100, by about 2095 or something like that, it will be at those levels. So a lot of the change and the growth that you're seeing is before that period. But again, then you make global assumptions and you adapt it to what the region and what the countries, because you build up this from country data that they have for the various countries. So there are different assumptions there.
I think a related question that Alicia asked is thinking about the education and how that's affecting fertility. Alicia, do you wanna expand on your question?
Yeah, I think if I understand the IASA projections, one of the assumptions is about the effects of education, improving education and completion of school rates, the effects that they will have on fertility. And I'm wondering if you know, like, has that assumption been challenged? Because in the countries with the poorest, with the lowest, secondary school completion rates, those are some of the countries that have the highest population growth rate. And so I think the, basing population projections on the assumption that that's somehow going to be magically overcome is strange. And I'm wondering if this has been brought up.
I think that's those are some of the questions, and so just to make the case that if you look at the three projections that are used, like the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation and the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis and the UN Population Division. The UN Population Division has the largest size projected for Sub-Saharan Africa. So all the other ones are lower. And the reason why I focused on the UN is that not only that it has a long trajectory, so you can actually see how that projection has moved over time. But if Africa's population growth is exceeding the UN population projection, then it will exceed every other one that is below that, the UN population projection, just by simple extension and of that. So the question whether there is no question that improvements in female education is generally will lead to reduced fertility and increased contraceptive use and all that. But achieving it is not something you achieve in a year, or in 2 or in 3, and all that. Is a long-term process. But its effect is both immediate, because the more girls stay in school, the less likely they are to get married or to have children and things like that. So there is an immediate effect, but also in their lifetime, they're also more likely to have smaller numbers of children. But again, the point I'm making here is that the early start of childbearing in Africa creates an internal momentum that is driving population growth through reduced intergenerational gap that is not being factored in any of these estimates. And that's why many times we end up with every new projection increasing the size of Africa's population in future.
Josh, do you have a question related?
Oh, I just wanted to clarify what Alex was saying there at the last part. Presumably these are all the same method of projection, cohort component projection with age-specific fertility rates. I guess what you're saying is that the forecasts are predicting a decline in young fertility that is not occurring. Is that what you're saying?
No. What I'm saying is that when you look at fertility, what you're not paying attention to is that it does make a difference whether this woman started childbearing at age 20 or at age 25 or at age 30, even if they end up with the same number of children. That the early start of childbearing creates shorter generations of women in the long term. And so that effect is not being captured when we do. It doesn't matter what assumptions we make in our projections. You are dealing with mortality, with fertility, with migration, and everything that affects them. And all the assumptions we are making is, how do they affect fertility? How do they affect mortality? How do they affect migration? And those are the things that we know as the components that change population size. But inbuilt in growth is also the gap between generations. And I give you just a very basic example of two populations that are exactly the same. But in one of them, all the women start childbearing at age 20, and in another, they all start childbearing at age 25. In 100 years, how would these two populations look like? Everything else being the same. And it is evident that even without changing any of the parameters in our projections, that the population in which women start childbearing consistently at age 20 will be much larger than the one where they start childbearing at age 25. And because Africa's population, because Africa's age at first birth is lower generally than in other regions of the world, that actually has this, makes this effect more pertinent for Sub-Saharan Africa.
So there's on a slightly different note, there's an interesting question on the Road and Belt Initiative and the impact on development in Africa from Jim Carey. Jim, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah, when I travel around Africa, almost every country, it seemed like the Chinese have a huge presence there with the roads and bridges and the infrastructure development. And wouldn't that have an impact in improving prosperity and demographic transition? Would that be kick in here at all?
If you ask me, my honest view is that the basic thing that drives development, these things are important, but they are not the essential things that change human capital development. If you don't have good education system and you don't have good health and nutrition and all of those, you can build the best roads and flyovers and whatever there, it doesn't change anything. It responds to 5% of the population that have cars, but the other 95% that do not have cars and do not care about those roads, the needs that they have is to be able to send their children to school, to be able to get them fed and deal with malnutrition in childhood and all of those, and healthcare and all of that. Those are the things that make a difference at the end of the day in developing human capital. So the infrastructure is important, and no question about that, but by itself may not necessarily lead to any appreciable change in outcomes for the majority of the people who may not have any need for those. And there are questions as well as to where these roads lead to, whether they lead to productive segments of the country, or they lead to the mines where you do your extractive industries and all of those, is a question that needs to be answered. So it's not a question of building the road, but does the road get to the places where farmers will be able to then access market, or is it going to the mines where you're able to extract natural resources and take them out of the country? So there are different questions one could ask about those.
Okay, thank you.
Alex, I have a question that both Alicia and Josh are actually interested in. So the question is, can you imagine a scenario where Sub-Saharan Africa goes the way of North Africa, and there's a sort of dramatic and surprising change in fertility that we're not predicting now? And if you think that's a possibility, and if it isn't a possibility, what do you think makes Sub-Saharan Africa different?
I've always believed that there is nothing exceptional about Sub-Saharan African fertility. Trust me, because first of all, people tell you, oh, it is like what Magufuli is saying, you know, to be a man, you have to have this many children and all of those, and how many does he have himself? So the point here is, we have examples of countries across Africa that have demonstrated and shown that actually you can achieve very rapid declines in fertility rates, very rapid increases in contraceptive use with the right types of policies in place and political leadership, Rwanda has shown us that it can be done. And you can compare Rwanda and Burundi. They're like day and night in terms of population dynamics in those two countries and the implications that has now for well-being in the two countries. You can look at Botswana and Zambia, pretty much close countries in many ways, and dependent on some natural resource, whether it's diamond or copper. But at the end of the day, look at their fertility rates from say the 1970s and 80s to where it is now, and look at how well they have done. You can look at many different countries that are connected in some ways. We can look at Kenya and Tanzania and see in 10 years where they are with this disruption in family planning programs in Tanzania. You can see the implications it has on the projected size of Tanzanian population going forward. So these temporary disruptions have huge implications and impact on population. And that's one of the things that we don't often pay as much attention to. That's okay, it's a 5-year disruption, but the impact of that could unfold over 50, 60 years with massive implications. So there is nothing exceptional about Africa and African fertility that it cannot go down. If we've done it in Rwanda, we can do it in Burundi. If we did it in Burundi, we can do it in DR Congo, we can do it in Nigeria, we can do it we can do it across the continent. It is possible. But I think in the places where it has worked, we've had very strong political leadership and support for family planning programs, improved access to services, and providing opportunities for women and especially girls to go to school. Rwanda showed that by having one of the fastest declines in child mortality rates in the world. And if we have these programs together, I think we can achieve significant change in population trajectories. Somebody has said it before that demography is not destiny. These are projections. And we've shown that actually, as high as they are for Africa, Africa has exceeded those projections and is likely to continue to exceed them unless we do something differently.
Thank you. Other questions before we wrap up? Anyone? Any burning questions? This is not related, I think, to your talk, guys, but I just one last question. Sort of, I've just been reading newspaper articles about the impact of COVID-19 on sort of marriage and age of marriage across sub-Saharan Africa. Do you foresee this being a long-lasting impact, or what do you think has been sort of the most detrimental effects in terms of thinking about population growth? Or maybe too early to tell.
The effect of COVID in Africa is still unfolding. And I think the first wave, many African countries really, except for South Africa and some Northern African countries, Morocco, Egypt, and co, were spared the worst, at least, of the pandemic. But now, at least, it looks like many countries are now facing up to it differently. So it depends on how soon vaccines get to Africa, how widespread it is and acceptance of it, and what happens. We do not have a full picture of where the trajectory of the pandemic is on the continent. The limited testing capacity is actually frustrating efforts to know where things are. That said, the question, whether this will affect population trajectories in Africa, it's really, I don't see that as, I don't know in what ways that will do, and that will play a role because the effect is not even within is not strongest among the reproductive age population. If we look at the experiences in other regions, it's been more older populations being more affected in many ways. And if that's the pattern we have in Africa, then how that affects population growth on the continent is likely to be a non-starter, because those people are not the ones having the children.
Thank you. Any other questions? Great. Well, maybe we can turn off our microphones, and thanks Alex for his great talk today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. And that was a very interesting talk.